Okay, welcome everyone. On behalf of the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Latinx College Graduation Rates, a look at Texas and California public universities, being presented by Dr. Estrada and Dr. Sáenz. My name is Kayla and I will be assisting as needed during the session. And after the presentation by our esteemed presenters, we will enter a period of participation Q&A. We ask that you please submit your questions through the Q&A box on Zoom. Please feel free to engage with both the presenters and attendees by using the chat feature throughout the webinar. And finally, this is a live webinar and it is being recorded. We appreciate each of you for attending. Now I will turn the session over to Dr. Sáenz and Dr. Estrada.
Thank you so much, Kayla. Well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate that you all have made time late in the academic year to join us to engage in this important conversation. On behalf of the board of the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education, I had the honor of serving in the board now for 5 years, was currently serving as an immediate past chair of the board. We are so delighted to be able to continue to bring our membership and our extended group of community members and stakeholders the opportunity to continue the conversation. We had a very successful conference back in late February, early March of this year. Once again, just want to thank our colleagues at the College of Southern Nevada in Las Vegas for hosting our 18th annual conference. And of course, we're already in the works for planning for next year's conference. Stay tuned for more details on that. That'll be in the early mid-March next year. Let's bring it back to why we're gathering here this morning or afternoon. I'm delighted to be here with my colleague and longtime colleague, Daniel Estrada with the Cal State system. And he'll be introducing himself a little bit more here in a bit. We're going to tag team, as it were. He's in California, I'm in Texas. And, as Daniel and I have known each other for a while and worked together on different projects, particularly with NELRAP, among other initiatives, we've often had conversations about, not only what's going on in Texas or what's going on in California, but certainly how those two states are, in many ways, are bellwethers in helping to understand the larger landscape of Latino student success in the nation. So we're going to do some sort of broad strokes here at the beginning. I'll introduce, a little bit of the national context. I'll zoom into Texas a little bit as well, particularly with an emphasis on Latino graduation rates, Latinx graduation rates, and how we want to be focused within our particularly public sector of higher education in each state on improving and facilitating greater Latino student success. So we are going to emphasize a lot of data today. I see a great group of folks that are joining us here from across the country. I imagine that many of you are probably well aware of some of this data. And so if you would indulge us just to help set the table a little bit as we engage in this important conversation. And hopefully spend the second half of our conversation engaged in talking about what are some promising practices and bright spots across the country, and certainly the illustrious group of participants here and attendees, feel free to share as well. I'm acting kind of in the role of moderator and also presenter, so pulling double duty here. So there is a Q&A feature. I encourage you to use that at your convenience. And without any further ado, I will kind of jump in here, if you will. So as we think about this issue, as we hopefully everybody can see all that. Daniel, does that look okay on your screen?
Yeah, I can see it.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So, we focus on what it means to ensure the success of Latinx students. So first things first, just so that we have some common vocabulary here, the different groups that we talk to engage different audiences, we always have to start with this idea of what is Latinx. And I think for several years now, many of us in the higher ed community have been utilizing and embracing this term. And, obviously we are using it as a proxy for the term Latina, Latino, or Hispanic, as some have historically used it. But it does designate a particular identity. It suggests a gender neutrality we want to be sort of more inclusive of. It also is a more gender inclusive form, so it's a way that we can be more equitable in our terminology with respect to the students that we're talking about and focused on. And also there's a political dimension to help disrupt this sort of gender binary, if you will, that tends to accompany a lot of our discussions around the college student experience. So I think we also know in the political arena that there has been some resistance to it as well. I think you'll find both Daniel and I will use this term perhaps interchangeably with Hispanic or others based on the kind of data that we are citing and utilizing throughout the presentation. But I thought it would just be a helpful way to start. So let's think about this and what it means. So again, this is the first example of using the terms interchangeably, only because I'm citing, in this case, census data. The Pew Hispanic Research Center pulls this data every year through the American Community Survey. And just again, help to set the table a little bit. The U.S. Hispanic population numbers well over 62 million as of 2021. We also know that continues to represent the largest share of increase around all the racial ethnic minority groups, that they track through the ACS. Now, we also know that within the Hispanic group, the origin groups, the national origin groups are quite diverse. So this is a broadly encompassing term, to be sure, continues to be the primary group of people are Mexican origin. As you see there, 59.5% of the U.S. Hispanic population is Mexican origin. But of course, that's also a wide diversity of other groups across the Americas, in fact, across the world. And so, just to understand that as we engage in this conversation, we also, in many ways, are masking a lot of the rich diversity that exists. So we recognize that, but as scholars, we want to make sure that we are, establishing that. Now, I see a good representation of people just looking at the list of participants. Some names I do recognize, and you all are all over the country. But as we think about, and again, this is data from Pew Research Center, as we think about how our country continues to change in the last 40 years, we can see that the population of the share of Hispanics population across the country continues to reshape the landscape. And as of 2020, you see that there's a higher and higher concentration of Hispanics or Latinos across countries, especially in areas that are historically, perhaps the community has not ever been represented in a critical mass. Certainly in the Southwest, but increasingly in areas of the country, the Deep South, the Carolinas, the Midwest, et cetera, where there's a higher concentration. Now, I think we'll also point out to this point that the fastest growing Hispanic populations tend to be in states that are not California and Texas. Imagine that, Daniel. And part of that is just a function of just the growth rates in these states. Again, these non-traditional areas of the country where Hispanic nativity was not really seen very rapidly. So as we think about that, Tennessee, South Carolina, Alabama, Kentucky, South Dakota are all important, increasingly becoming bellwether states as far as the growth of the Latino community. Now, every year, an estimated 1 million Latino students are turning 18 years old, right? So in a state like Texas, that number is about 200,000 annually. That's a pretty big chunk of young people. To put it in perspective, that's roughly the size of several small states in the country. So as we think about growth, as we think about how our institutions, both 2-year and 4-year, are serving this fast-growing population, that also means that more and more of our higher ed institutions are quote unquote becoming HSIs or emerging HSIs. And of course, we know several scholars and certain centers around the country, including Excelencia in Education and HACU, track that number very closely. I think currently we're at about 550 or so HSIs, plus several hundred emerging HSIs. And of course, that's very, very much driven by the population. So who are Latinx college students? Well, when more than a third are first generation. That means they're first in their family to go to college. About a quarter or so are immigrants. That doesn't mean they're all DACA students, but they could be permanent residents or whatnot. About a tenth of all our Latinx students are undocumented, most of whom may fall under the DACA criteria. And then more than half start higher education at community colleges. In Texas, I can tell you that almost 3/4 of all Latino students start higher education at the community college. So again, as we think about ensuring the success of these students, we have to recognize where they are beginning. And a big reason for that, certainly in Texas, is the growth in the last 2 decades of our dual credit, dual enrollment pathways. Many of those opportunities are anchored at community colleges in partnership with local school districts. So there's a lot happening there in that space. And I know in this state, like in many others, we're really taking a hard look at what does it mean that so many of our students, particularly from the Latino community, are beginning higher ed at the community college. I can tell you that in Texas, that sector is being very, very intentional in designing through guided pathways and through a variety of other approaches, very intentional pathways to degree and to earning a credential. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, particularly the latest round of a sort of higher ed agenda that we have in the state called Building a Talent Strong Texas, and how that's shaping that conversation going forward. Now, we know, generally speaking, nationally, that Hispanic college going rates have been going up for some time relative to every other group. The Latino community, particularly students that identify as Hispanic or Latinx, are increasing. And you can see that that's been a pretty steady rate in the last 30, 40 years. But on the other end, we know we can get them in, but are we getting them out, right? That's the big question. Well, there are several policies in place around the country that may or may not be facilitating that success to help ensure the success. One of those examples of a policy at the state level is the tuition equity law that are rampant around the country. This is the latest information from the National Immigration Law Center that kind of looks around the country at what states have enacted what they deem tuition equity laws that can help support particularly undocumented or immigrant students. As you saw earlier, a good chunk of those are identified as Latino students. And as you can see, the Southwest, particularly some of these states, the largest states like California and Texas, have led the charge in providing in-state tuition benefits. That's another way to think about tuition equity laws. But other states have been more resistant, particularly, as you might recall, in areas of the country where the community continues to grow, like in the Deep South. That's no coincidence, right? So that's that's no accident, I should say. And so I think there's a reality here. There's a political dimension with the growth of the Hispanic community, the growth in enrollment rates. Whereas where we see some states perhaps being much more proactive, we see other states being resistant, and that continues to be a key feature of as we think about how we can plan as higher ed administrators and leaders to help facilitate the success of all of our students, but particularly this fast-growing group. Now, some of you may know that the work I do here in Texas, we have been very focused in the growing gender gap in educational attainment among the Hispanic population of students. And we see now that for the last 30 years or so, since the early 1990s, there's been this sort of divergent trend line with respect to, in this case, the proportion of bachelor's degrees awarded to Latinos by gender. And as we track this data and we project it going forward, we actually are projecting that these trend lines will continue to diverge. Meaning, the production of bachelor's degrees among Hispanic males is not keeping pace with the production for Hispanic females. And again, in and of itself, that has been a big part of the impetus behind the work that me and my colega, Dr. Luis Ponjuan, who's also on the AAHHE board, have been deeply engaged in concert with many, many partners across the country, but especially here in Texas. I'm going to talk more about that here in a bit. Now, as far as degree attainment rates, drilling down a little bit more closely, we see that about 3 out of every 5 degrees earned by any Hispanic student in this country is earned by a Hispanic female. Now, in and of itself, that's not that's a good thing. That's ought to be celebrated. But again, as we focus on males and this growing gender gap, the urgency of the demographic sort of reality across the country is such that we have to continue to ask these questions about what is happening with our males that are not keeping pace with females, and how has COVID exacerbated that, because it certainly has. So the work I do, the work we help to spotlight through AAHHE, through the AAHHE community, is pretty broad. And this is a very not exhaustive list. I'll fully acknowledge that, of areas of research that we tend to highlight and focus on with respect to the understanding the college student experiences for Latino students, Latinx students, as they matriculate through higher education. And this is a sampling of areas that of scholarship that continues to emerge, whether it's focused on financial aid and financial aid literacy, challenges through transition, academic integration, the transition experience, the transfer experience from 2 to 4 years, et cetera, et cetera. Emerging research also is focusing on HSIs and given the growth in that sector of higher education institutions, how well are these institutions serving those Hispanic students? So more and more is also focused more intentionally on how we can think about serving students at HSIs. Now, as I said earlier, I'm zooming in a little bit more in Texas now, and with a particular focus on male students, which is the work we do with Project Males. So in the Texas context, we track 8th graders here in the state very closely. For every 100 8th graders back in 2009, we track them 11 years later. And so we know that this is roughly 2020 data. Only 18% of those male 8th graders have earned some type of post-secondary credential within that 11-year period. But disaggregating further for Hispanic males and African-American males, we see that those numbers are even lower. Troubling to say the least. Certainly, as we think about this work in Texas, we recognize that the pandemic has only made these kinds of trends even worse, quite frankly. Now, in Texas, we work with many regions around the state of Texas. A big state. We could divide it up into 5 or 6 states if we could. Every region is very different, has a very sort of compelling set of narratives and underlying conditions. And here's a good example of that. Using the same 8th grade cohort data, we can see that certain parts of the state, like in South Texas, where Edinburgh is, that's region 1, the Hispanic male students in those regions are doing better relative to Hispanic males in other parts of the state that are more urban. Like in the Austin area, Richardson is where the Dallas Service Center is, Fort Worth, etc., Houston. So you see those at the lower end, whereas some of the more border regions or South Texas regions of the state, Hispanic males seem to be doing well. So as we think about the work we do in Texas that Luis and I and many other colleagues do across the state, we recognize there's such a variety of experiences that are happening for our Hispanic students and Latinx students, particularly our male students. And so when we work with partners, we do so thoughtfully, just recognizing the rich array of difference. To that end, as we look at our 4-year sector here in Texas, we have, this is most of our 4-year institutions. As we think about their predicted graduation rate versus the actual, some are outperforming, right? So we have examples like UTRGV and Sam Houston State. Perhaps some of those reps are in the audience this morning that are outperforming their predicted graduation rate 4 and 6 years. So it's not enough just to say, what is the actual, right? If I sorted this by actual, it would be a very different pecking order, if you will. But I think all of us could agree that we ought to be interested in highlighting what are the institutions that are actually outperforming their predicted graduation rate based on sort of the underlying characteristics of their student body. And yes, UTRGV, Sam Houston State, UT Dallas, these are key sort of bright spots that we ought to be focused on more intentionally, especially when you consider the proportion of the students that are Pell eligible. UTRGV in particular, has the highest number of Pell eligible students down in South Texas. Again, if you line that up with the earlier data, the 8th grade cohort data, you can see that region tends to also outperform the other regions of the state. So that predictably, you might expect UTRGV and institutions in South Texas. I might add that I'm originally from South Texas, although it has nothing to do with why I might be highlighting that region of the state. I just want to point out that these are exactly the kind of conversations we ought to be having. And perhaps we ought to be visiting folks like Dr. Karen Lozano and others down in South Texas, of course, President Guy Bailey and their new provost, Luis Zayas. But as you see, though, the flagships, UT Austin, Texas A&M, are also doing well. Obviously, we recognize they're already getting the top 10%, in the case of Texas, top 6% kids. And so they should be doing well, but they're also outperforming their predicted rates. But they don't serve as many Pell eligible, right? The proportion relative to some of the other institutions across the state is also key here. In fact, Texas State and UTEP and UTSA and Texas Tech, they have an outsized number of Pell eligible students. And again, as we think about this population, particularly Latino students, these are the key data that we got to look at, right? We should be focused on how well they're doing overall, but certainly how well they're doing with more specific populations when we know there's more urgent need, and really understand, how it is that they're supporting those students. So lastly, I'll finish with some shameless plugs, as I mentioned to Daniela, since we are in Texas, and I want to make sure that I highlight the important work that my colegas with Project Males have been engaged in. We founded Project Males 10 years ago with a very intentional focus on understanding Latino student success, particularly for male students, and have since expanded to focus more intentionally on male students of color. And we do so through a variety of means. Nationally, we have a research institute that is constantly pushing out and disseminating research, a national affiliate network of over 65 scholars who do this work across the country. If you have an interest in connecting with any of those affiliates, please let us know. You can find us on their website. Just Google Project Mills. Our student mentoring program is our local work here in the Austin area, Central Texas. We are honored to work with school districts where we're providing direct services to students and schools. We continue to do that every year for the last 10 years, and we're very, very appreciative of the opportunity to do that work, because that's a direct impact on students as we track them through the pipeline and hopefully get them into places like UT Austin and Austin Community College and many of our other Central Texas partners like Texas State and others. And then finally, at the state level, we're engaged in a statewide learning community that we convene regularly, also going on 10 years, the Texas Ed Consortium for Male Students of Color. So again, we utilize a variety of different strategies to do this work, to say not only are we going to move the needle, try to move the needle, but we're going to actually help to raise the level of capacity of our partner institutions across the state of Texas to better serve those students as well. And lastly, I'll just finish with this as just an invitation to all of you. The graphic you see here is from last year's, but this year we're hosting our 10th annual Texas Male Student Leadership Summit here at UT Austin, August 10th and 11th. Feel free to email me. We always welcome visitors from all over the country to this event, but of course it's focused on our statewide consortium. And all of you are invited. If you're interested, as I said, please follow up. These are my details, contact information, as well as our website, where you can find more information about our work. So, okay, I'm looking at my clock. I'm 20 minutes in, Daniel. I'm leaving you plenty of time for you to do your thing, sir. I'm going to stop share now. And I will mind the chat box and any questions that come in, as well as we transition to you and then the Q&A afterwards.
Yeah, thank you for starting out, because some of the data that you presented, I'll be presenting as well, particularly on the gender gap, which I conclude with that on my presentation. So let me see if I can bring this up. Okay, how does that look? And I'm trying to remove that floating menu there.
Looks good. You're good.
Okay, Victor, is that looking okay?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Looks great.
Looks good.
Okay. So let's go to the second slide. And there we go. I decided to do a summary because there's a total of 36 slides in this presentation. I don't think I'll be going over all of them, and some I may go over rather quickly. Others, like this one, I'm going to give the audience a chance to take a look at the bullet points, and then I'll make some comments on it. For example, the bullet point at the very end. And looking at the data on the California State University system, it confirms that there is a serious gender gap. And as we go through the slides on that data, I will point that out. Now, the California State University system has been engaged in what they call a graduation initiative since 2009. And there has been some recent progress, which I will be pointing out. My data looks at 2016 and 2017. These are the freshmen that came in those years. Now, last year, the class of 2018 also graduated, and that data is now available on the CSU dashboard. I will show you a link which will take you to that information. What I find overall in these graduation rates is that there's quite a variation between campuses, where I spread them out into 3 tiers. Tier 1 are campuses that have graduation rates above 40%. And in the 2017 data, there were 4 campuses. Tier 2 are the campuses that have graduation rates above 30%. And here again, in 2017, there were 4 campuses. And Tier 3, which has had some progress since 2018, which I said that data is now available. In Tier 3 are the campuses for 2017 that had graduation rates below 30%. Several of those campuses are now in tier 2. So as I'm talking here, you can see that with the 3 tiers, there's quite a lot of variation, 40%, 30%, and below 30%. And in 2017, 14 of the CSU campuses were below 30%. That has changed somewhat for 2018, but again, there's still a lot of work to do. The other thing that I've found is that the entrance requirements have changed. Overall, it was supposed to be the top third of high school students were guaranteed a seat in the state university system. The top 12.8% were guaranteed a seat in the University of California. That no longer exists. Like many aspects of the California Master Plan, it's been pretty much ignored. So again, down at the bottom here in red is a statement on the gender gap, and I will show you the data that confirms that this gender gap very much exists, and it is very significant for Latinx students. The California State University system has 23 campuses. Of those 23 campuses, 21 are Hispanic serving institutions, which means that more than 25% of the full-time enrollment consists of Latino students. So you can see that the campuses are spread up and down the state. To the north is Humboldt, and down below is San Diego State. And then many of the campuses are in Southern California because that is basically where the population of California is concentrated. And then you have several more campuses in the Central and Northern California areas. The CSU, or California State University System, was created in 1960 under the California Master Plan for Higher Education. These campuses are a direct descendant of the California normal schools. And as I said before, the plan says that 1/8, or 12.5% of the high school students would be guaranteed a seat in the University of California, or the top 1/8. And then the next system, the state universities, were to accept the top 1/3 of graduating high school seniors. Now that no longer exists. Not only that, but these institutions were supposed to be tuition free, and now tuition is a very significant part of being able to continue in these four-year institutions. Now, overall, the state universities of California, which is the largest system in the country, have a total of 468 students. That consists of 391 undergraduates and 55,075 graduate students. The reason why I'm bringing up this report, even though it's a decade old, is the fact that the point it's making is very much real for California. There needs to be investment, particularly in Latino students. And I'm going to show you the system-wide data so you get an idea of how significant the Latino student population is for the state university system. And again, this information goes back a decade, but it makes the point that I want to present here. And that is, if you look at California, New Mexico, Texas, Florida, and then you have Arizona and Nevada. In California alone, more than half the public school students are Latino. So where are the state universities going to recruit from? It's going to be largely from the public schools. And that issue is in New Mexico and Texas as well. But Dr. Sáenz has already covered that, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. What I do want to go into is this table, which also Dr. Sáenz presented. But you can see that I'm going to clarify that, non-Hispanic white students are declining in enrollment. This is the current decline at negative 12.58%, and this is the projected decline in negative 18.07%. On the other hand, with Latino students, you have increases at 55.39% and projected changes at 72.59%. Other students of color, African American and Asian, also have increases, but they are minor compared to Latino students. So I'm saying to the educators, this is the population to focus on. In California, we have a 4-year bachelor's degree shortage. So the blue is what we're supplying, the blue chart or blue bar chart, and the orange bar is what the demand is, and that constitutes over 1 million degrees. At the same time, particularly since the Great Recession and Proposition 13 in the late 1970s, state appropriations to the University of California and the state university system has significantly declined. And you can see that the orange bar is tuition, and the blue bar here in the UC system is state appropriations. Now, this is 2006, before the Great Recession. In 2012, this is reverse. Tuition now constitutes more of the contributions to the UC operating expenses compared to state appropriations, which is outlined in blue. The same trend exists in the California State University system. So even though the state of California has a shortage of 4-year degrees to support its industry, it has been divesting. Now, Governor Brown tried to change this to level off tuition, and there were very few increases in tuition during his administration. But we need to reverse the picture so that it looks like 2006 rather than 2012. The percentage of California bachelor's degrees awarded is very much overwhelmingly the task of the California State University system. Here you see several fields and the percentage of degrees that the CSU awards, like agriculture, 62%, business, 54%, health and medicine, 44%, hospitality and tourism, 64%, engineering, and media culture and design. Now, these are 4-year degrees, not graduate degrees, okay? I know this letter is hard to read because the print's very small, but this is a letter from Chancellor White going back to 2015 to, at that time, the director of California LULAB. And the question that Mr. Rodriguez was raising had to do with the policy of impaction, which the state university system is now abandoning because now they're suffering from under-enrollment. But the chancellor's response to that is quite interesting. And here I zoomed in. He says authentic access requirements that every student admitted to the CSU should have an equal chance to graduate with skills necessary to succeed in their careers. So besides just getting access, what Dr. White is saying is that we need to guarantee graduation. And then he gets into the plan for a graduation initiative going to 2025. So it is the policy currently of the CSU to improve the graduation rates. But as you're going to see, there's quite a lot of variation from campuses that are doing it versus those that are not. And I'm specifically pointing out 4-year graduation rates, which many campuses are below 30% still, and the goal of achieving 40% on incoming freshmen graduating in 4 years. And the reason why I emphasize that is because financial aid. The Pell Grants only last for 4 years. That's what my students tell me. After that, if they don't graduate in 4 years, they're incurring more and more debt. And as I said before, the state university system like the University of California, these are now tuition-based institutions. The education is no longer free. So not only may a student not graduate, but he will incur a lot of debt. Not a good way to start out as a young person. These are the system-wide data. And you can see that I'm focused on 2016 and 2017. I will mention some of the 2018 data, which is now available on the State University dashboard. Also note the GPAs. So I'm going to contrast GPAs, which are required for admission, against graduation rates. And then down below, you see the dramatic differences in female graduation rates versus male. This is the gender gap. And as I go through these campuses, every single one has a gap between male and female achievement. Here you see system-wide data for Latino students, and they constitute 45% of the full-time enrollment. This is why you have 21 out of 23 campuses being Hispanic serving institutions. And here you see the average GPA. Now, this is the average, but when you take a look at campuses like Cal State or Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, you're going to see a much higher GPA. At the same time, you see that Latino graduation rates are a bit lower than the overall system-wide graduation rates. And yet the GPAs are not that different. And again, for Latinos or Latinx, the gender gap is even more significant than system-wide, or the overall system-wide. These are the websites where you can find this data. There's demographic information where the students come from, including out-of-state students. And here, the second URL is where I received or obtained the graduation and continuation rates. Okay, and today, if you look at this website today, you'll see that it's been updated for 2018. Here's San Luis Obispo, and I mentioned before, you have GPAs of 3.92 in 2016, and for 2017, it went up to 3.93. I'm asking, why doesn't a student go to the University of California if you've got a GPA like that? And the graduation rates are important because you see, in 2016, San Luis Obispo was graduating more than half its students, 59.6, and in 2017, 61.2%. And that's well above the goal of the California State University system of 40%. And if you look at the graduation rates by gender, again, on this campus, the gender gap is very obvious. Now, keep in mind these GPAs, 3.9. Latinos coming in have a 3.9 GPA. I said San Luis Obispo is the only campus other than the Maritime College, which I'm not counting. It's the only campus that is not an HSI because Latinos are about 19% of the student population. And this data comes from 2017 for every campus right now. And you also have a gender gap. In spite of the fact that Latinos are coming in with competitive GPAs, their graduation rates are lower. Now, these are all campuses in Tier 1. So San Luis Obispo is Tier 1, San Diego State is Tier 1. The GPA for incoming freshmen is 3.69. In 2017, that was 3.71. And the graduation rates are well above 40%. 2016, 53.5, 2017, 56%. And again, we're confirming the gender gap. Here you have the data for Latino students. Latinos are 33% of the student population. And over here in 2017, I really want to emphasize this. The GPAs of Latino students entering San Diego State as freshmen was at 3.72, which is higher than the overall population of the campus. And yet the graduation rates are lower. And again, if you look at the last couple of lines, Latinos and gender, we have a gap there too. Tier 1 also includes Sonoma State. I'm just going to go over this very quickly. Their GPAs are much lower than San Luis Obispo, or slow. But their graduation rates, they've been able to get above 40%. And again, there's a gender gap. Here are Latino students, GPAs are competitive, but the graduation rates are lower. And you have a significant gender gap for Latinos. Monterey Bay, GPA 3.33 in 2016, 3.41, 2017. And in 2017, Monterey Bay was able to get their graduation rates above 40%. If you look at the 2018 data, they dropped along with Sonoma State to 39%. And again, this campus has a gender gap, and it's even more pronounced for Latinx students. Latinos at Monterey Bay constitute 52% of the student population. Their GPAs are competitive, but the graduation rates are below 40%. I'm going to go very quickly on tier 2. Long Beach is just under 40%. They went back up in 2018 to 38%. GPAs are 3.5 and 3.53 overall. The gender gap is there. Latinos, 46% of the student population. Their GPAs are competitive, but their graduation rates are lower than the overall campus. And they have significant differences in graduation rates by gender. Here you have Cal State Fullerton. Fullerton for 2018, like Long Beach, went up to 38% on the graduation rates. But here you can see in 2017, Fullerton was at 36.2%. The GPAs were 3.58 for 16 and 2017, 3.63% overall for all students, all freshmen coming in. And you can see the gender gap between males and females. Finally, with Latino students, they constitute 47% of the student population, and their GPAs are competitive. Their graduation rates are a bit lower, and there is a very significant gender gap among Latinos in terms of achievement. I summarize the last two campuses, Chico State and San Jose State. The same trends are there. They did have some improvement in 2018, and we'll talk about that later. Finally, in tier 3, there are 14 campuses as of 2017. That has changed in 2018. More campuses went up to tier 2. So now you have less than 14 in tier 3. But for 2017 and 2016, the highs were well below 30%. There's only one campus at 29.1%. And most of the campuses are in the low area, okay? So there is significant variation. I think that variation is a very important point for the CSG system of the Chancellor's Office to focus on. Because yes, it looks like they're achieving their goal of getting a system-wide graduation rate of 40%. But yet there's a lot of campuses being left behind that really need to service their students in a way that accommodate freshmen to graduate in 4 years. This is the initiative, and you can see it began in 2009, and they want to achieve those goals in a couple more years. This report talks about intervention, and even though it's a report that was put together in 2006, I like the question that they're answering, and I'm going to read that and then finish up. The question is, what institutional conditions, policies, programs, practices, cultural properties are associated with student success? Besides the focus on student success, there should also be a focus on Latino education. That's why I'm talking about California investing in Latino higher education. And here are several reasons why. In 2010, the non-Hispanic white population was at 40.1%. The Latino population was at 37.6%. That changed in 2020. The Latino population is now at 39.4%. The non-Hispanic white population at 34.7%. So Latinos constitute the largest group of residents in the state of California. This will continue. And the reason why is when you look at the youthfulness of the Latino population, their population under 18 years of age stands at 28.9%. The rest of the residents of California, their youth under 18 population is at 17.6%. So that predicts pretty much a continuance of growth among the Latinos. Like I said, the public school enrollment is growing. So the entrance of many more students in four-year colleges in the state is driven by those demographics. Finally, I'm just reiterating what Dr. Sáenz had already emphasized, and that is we have a growing gender gap. If we could focus, if the state university system could focus on the male students, I think this gender gap particularly among Latinos, I think this gender gap could narrow instead of growing wider and wider. And finally, to conclude, student success should be the goal of the state university system. And I'm encouraged by the results so far that they will hopefully gain or achieve their goal of 40% on freshman four-year graduation rates. Okay, Dr. Sáenz, if you want to say anything more, I am done with my report.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Appreciate you. And lots of data there to absorb. Our apologies in advance to all the attendees because they got bombarded by data from me and from you. But
yeah,
you know, these conversations often start there with data, but they shouldn't just end there, right? So I think we have about 15 minutes left here for some Q&A. And you know, I know you and I had been meeting, you know, in the last few weeks in prep for this, and I don't think we necessarily had intended to focus so intently on the gender gap, but you know, it is obviously quite an important topic here. You know, I often and I just want to address that because I imagine it might be in the minds of some of our attendees. You know, this is not a zero-sum context, right? So I think as we highlight these disparities, it's often rooted and anchored from a place of equity and understanding, you know, where those inequities may exist and persist. And you know, I do treat and approach this work in that same way, but it isn't a zero-sum context. In other words, we're not suggesting that we should focus on this gender gap or focus on Latino males at the exclusion of anyone else, right? We have the energy and time and should devote as much energy and time as we can to focus on all these inequities. We understand that Latinas are also underrepresented in certain fields. We also understand the persistent and stubborn wage gap that persists across fields. I mean, on and on. So we can have the opportunity to have this conversation in thoughtful ways without at all dismissing the important equity work that continues and must continue in our work. So with that in mind, the first question that popped up here from the Q&A, lo and behold, is also related to this question. I think partly because I think you and I focus so much on this. And you know, what are the reasons why we see Latino males falling behind, quote unquote, in higher education? And you know, great question, Annie. And I'll say that I don't know if you caught on my language on this gender gap. I phrase it as, why are Latino males not keeping pace with their female counterparts, right? So it's a different way of spinning it or framing it, but I do choose to frame it in that way. I think the narratives around this work are so important. I think I know the work we do with Project Males, and Daniel, and I'm sure you as well, we're very careful not to sort of perpetuate deficit narratives around this work, right? And so I think I'll start with that it is a matter of framing it in the way of saying, well, the males aren't keeping pace with females, because females are certainly performing at greater rates across the board, across all racial ethnic groups, not unique to the Latino community. You know, so why is it happening? Well, you know, if we had much more time, we often do a lot of work on this through Project Males, particularly in how the issues that we see manifest in community colleges and 4 years that all of us work and represent often emerge much earlier in the educational pipeline. And so that's part of the reason why through our work here in Texas, we do work a lot very closely with school districts at the K-12 level, because we recognize that the way that our special education policies get administered can be quite inequitable, particularly for boys of color who are significantly overrepresented in the special education pipeline, especially in the categories that are often deemed learning or behaviorally challenged. And that's not a new phenomenon. The Office of Civil Rights, Department of Ed has been tracking this data of overrepresentation for decades, right? So it's not new, but what we see is that as the population has grown, we see more and more of these young boys get pushed into these pathways. And then from there, of course, we also know they're overrepresented in the school discipline pipeline. That's especially true for African-American boys, but also for Hispanic boys in middle school and high school. You know, and that's given birth to narratives like the school to prison pipeline, right? So we don't necessarily embrace that narrative, but it's a reality that often accompanies the experience of these young men as they try to matriculate through the educational system. We also know that the teacher ranks, the teacher workforce continues to shift and is now over 85% female in this country. There are fewer and fewer male teachers, and when there are male teachers, they tend to be thrust into very sort of gender-specific roles, like the disciplinarian or the administrator or the coach, if you will, right? So again, we got to continue to advance how we can utilize male teachers across a variety of different ways as being more in nurturing and caring sort of roles within schools, so that boys and young girls can see male teachers in that light as well. So there's a variety of challenges there, structural and systemic inequities that we can see at work as to why boys are quote unquote falling behind. And that has nothing to do with what we do in higher education. That's all before they even get to our doorsteps, right? So I think we got to be able to acknowledge and understand, how these young men, as they matriculate and persevere and arrive at our doorsteps, are being equipped and prepared to be successful, right? And meet them where they are and when they arrive, obviously. We see a lot of higher institutions being very aggressive and ambitious in their pre-college programs and engagement, and designing either summer bridge programs or, pre-college, high school programs, you name it, where possible, to further engage, and I mentioned during my part of the presentation that community colleges in Texas are being very intentional in designing these opportunities for young students, particularly through their dual credit relationships that they have with many school districts. Many community colleges in Texas have an early college high school on their campus, right, or a T-STEM high school or some other model like that. So they have actual high school students on their campus, which can be a really powerful thing, very compelling for the long-term success of these young people. So yes, we see all sectors of higher education, I think, have a role to play in this important conversation. And I think we are being mindful that given a state like Texas and California, not just the demographic reality, but as Daniel and I talked about a lot, also the political reality is quite distinct, to say the least. And I think my office is literally 4 blocks away from our state capitol here in Austin. And right now, Senate Bill 17, among others, being debated in both chambers, might severely hamper our ability to serve students in the ways that we know we need to, in light of the various different challenges that they have when they arrive at our doorstep. And that's quite concerning, to say the least. My role as acting associate dean for equity and inclusive excellence here in my college, these are conversations that are present day in and day out. Obviously, we're living and breathing it, but I also have the privilege and honor of working with so many community college leaders across the state of Texas and four-year university leaders as well. And they're feeling it too, perhaps even more so, because so much of what is being directed right now feels like it's directed at places like UT Austin, but ultimately will be felt in it by all of our institutions, and especially ultimately by our students. And so, I think we, in this political climate, must work more proactively and creatively, if you will, because we know that these issues are going to persist. These challenges for our students are going to persist, and we got to continue to keep our eye on the prize of, ramping up student success for all students. And as our campuses become more and more sort of Hispanic serving, if you will, how are we emphasizing what that servingness means? How are we operationalizing that? Excellencia in Education is helping to do some of that through their seal of Excellencia work. And I know many of the Cal States as well are also in that category. So I'll stop there to see if Daniel can weigh in on some of these issues.
Victor, you mentioned the issue of male students being criminalized, and that is the focus of a book that I'm publishing right now. In California, we still have the gang enhancement law. If you have any association with a gang, you commit a crime and get convicted, you could serve a longer sentence or spend more time in probation or parole. Not only that, but if you go through the juvenile justice system, in most cases, you cannot return to your school district. You're stuck with continuation schools that are gang infested. And a more recent issue that the California legislature has taken up is the gang database. You can be put on a database like that without ever committing a crime. And the legislature is asking for more transparency. And this affects our youth, particularly youth of color. If you're put on the gang database, you have to receive a letter, some information that says that you're going to be on the gang database, and you should have an opportunity to challenge that. Otherwise, this database is being used particularly to criminalize youth of color. And once you're in the juvenile justice system, your life chances are just going downward. Many opportunities that other youth have, these youth in the juvenile justice system do not have. And I've spent 19 years working with the juvenile justice system. So I've seen this time and time again. I've tried to get these students enrolled in a four-year institution. They won't be admitted because they don't meet the criteria. So the only options they have is a community college. The data that I presented on the CSU dashboard, it really needs to be disaggregated in terms of, say, for example, Latino students. How many are dominantly Spanish speaking versus English speaking? How many are the first generation to attend college? And what I've seen is there's some attempts to address this, but the transparency doesn't go as far as disaggregating the data. And a lot of it, is off of iPads. So this I think would be helpful, particularly for policymakers in terms of developing programs to address the distinctions between these students.
Yeah, great points, Danielle. And then, I want to respond to some of the comments on the chat here. And the Demicia earlier asked about Senate Bill 17. Richard is as well. That's a bill that I referenced here in Texas that might be eliminating the DEI work. So I conscious that I'm a state employee, so I'm being, I'm speaking only on my own behalf as a scholar with research expertise in this area. I'll share that, look, many of us have been doing DEI work all our careers. Maybe we didn't call it that, but we've been doing it, and I know this is the latest iteration of that work. Most of these policymakers probably couldn't even define what DEI even means. It's become sort of coded language, as we know, that as a catch-all, whether it be woke or CRT or you name it, right? So I think we recognize that there's sort of a playbook at work here in a state like Texas or Florida and other states around the country. And again, we were doing this work before these quote unquote attacks began. We're going to continue to do this work because we're educators of conscience, and we recognize that the work is important. Many of us who represent these communities understand we're one of a handful that in our ranks, whether it's faculty members or administrators, there's still significant disparities, right, at those ranks. And so I think it's incumbent on us to ensure that we stay true to our convictions and our core values, recognizing that we are on the right side of these issues, and we're going to continue to do this work and find creative and thoughtful ways to do it because we've been doing it all along. And I think and it's also the right thing to do given the demographic urgency and reality that states like Texas and California are facing. And I think that has nothing to do with politics. It's being imbued with politics by others, unfortunately. And I think all of us as educators of conscience need to continue to remember, what it was that called us into the craft, into the vocation of being educators. And so I think that is part and parcel of what we need to be and remain committed to. And I say all of that, again, recognizing that I am a state employee here, because that's what we're called to do, right? And certainly working in a college of education, where we're training teachers and school administrators, we have to continue to be mindful of that reality. So the other question that we received, and we're already up on time here, so I want to be mindful of that. I think Daniel, it's probably best that we do call it here, because there's no question that we could go on for another half hour, an hour easily.
Victor,
you want to share some parting thoughts here? Yes, sir.
Yeah. Go ahead.
You want to share? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, this is being recorded, so if anybody wants to catch it later, I assume it's going to be on YouTube. And then the PowerPoints, would you be able to distribute them if people leave their email addresses? I certainly have been already sending mine out. Absolutely, and I think Kayla Reed, who's behind the scenes with AAHHE, will ensure that we share all the slides with all the attendees, including those who had to maybe drop out or couldn't join us after all. A lot of great questions. Vanessa asked a great question earlier. There was another one in the Q&A that came in as well, to focus more intently on strategies. And
So, obviously we are out of time, and I think what I'll do is, AAHHE hosts these webinars on a regular basis. You have a long library of others you could choose from, certainly, but we will continue to, convene around these conversations. What are the specific strategies that are working, especially given the political reality that some of our states may be grappling with respect to this work. So we will continue. You have our commitment, certainly as a membership organization. We want to be responsive to our members and the kind of expertise and technical support that they're seeking out. So if you have ideas for how we might construct future orientation, webinar topics and all that, send them our way. We continue to host these webinars on a pretty regular basis. So you have our commitment that we'll continue to do that for certain. And we so appreciate that you all made time for us this afternoon. I know that my grades are due today. Some of y'all might have similar situations happening here. I wish all of you a very successful end to the academic year. And as we often said throughout our various different forms of engagement, siga la lucha sigue. And that was our theme for this year at the AAHHE conference. And obviously that obviously will continue to inspire the work of all of our work going forward. Daniel, any last thoughts?
No, I think you put it together pretty well. And I'm hoping you continue with your success with AAHHE. Okay.
Thank you.
Have a good day.